You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. Glad to be able to join you guys on the third night of KWAZ. As I previously stated, that every night of KWAZ, we will be doing a show. Before I get into tonight's paper, which I intend to read with little commentary because it's a pretty long paper. Let me just remind you guys of what else there is on the KWAZ Radio Podcast Network.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
All right, make sure to tune in to other shows on KWAZ Radio. So tonight's show, we're talking about the foundations of Black solidarity, collective identity, or common oppression. This paper was written by Tommie Shelby. So let's read this opening quote here. We are one with you under the ban of prejudice and proscription. One with you under the slander of inferiority. One with you in social and political disfranchisement. What you suffer, we suffer. What you endure, we endure. We are indissolubly united and must fall or flourish together. Right, as you can see, this topic really comes out of the idea of the third principle of KWAZ, which is Ujima, right, which honors a commitment to active and informed togetherness on matters of common interest. So this is a common interest night, and this paper covers common interests, right? In an effort to liberate Blacks from the burden of racial oppression, Black leaders have frequently called on Black Americans to become a more unified collective agent for social change. And while there are irrational, impractical, or perhaps even morally objectionable, I take it that many people, both Black and non-Black, believe it to be essential for Black people to achieve the full freedom and social equality that American ideals promise. However, even among those who agree that Black solidarity is important for bringing about racial justice, there is a substantial disagreement over the precise meaning of this solidaristic commitment. Such disagreement can be quite fundamental, as can be seen by comparing the following two views on the scope and significance of black political solidarity. Common oppression theory states that blacks should unite and work together because they suffer common oppression, and they can overcome or ameliorate their shared condition only through black solidarity. There's also collective self-determination theory. Blacks should unite and work together because they are oppressed people, people with their own distinctive racial, ethnic, cultural, and/or national identity. And as a people, blacks have interests that are best served by their becoming a self-determining group. As you know, we discussed self-determination last night, or last episode. Though they are somewhat similar in underlying motivation, the two political theories are importantly different. The common oppression theory, the least radical of the two, simply acknowledges the existence of anti-black racism in America and calls on those who suffer under it to act collectively to end that oppression, or at least to reduce its impact on their lives. The goal of this political program, then, is to free blacks from anti-black racism, and it sees black solidarity as a necessary means to that end. The collective self-determination theory, on the other hand, is a form of black nationalism, and it maintains that blacks need to work together to bring about their collective self-realization as people. Generally more pessimistic about the prospects for ending anti-black racism, this program seeks relief for black people through collective autonomy, that is political, economic, social, and/or cultural, and calls for black solidarity to bring this about. My concern in this essay is primarily with the status of the common oppression theory. For while it is sometimes misunderstood or outright rejected, it is a position that I believe blacks should embrace. And of course, some already do. Though the collective determination theory, with its goal of black collective self-realization, certainly has its adherents, and it too is worthy of extended critical discussion, I will not be concerned to take it up here, at least not directly. However, in an effort to defend and clarify the common oppression theory, and to further distinguish it from black nationalism, I want to scrutinize a doctrine that is often thought to be a component of both conceptions of black solidarity. By the way, even though I might not be doing too much commentary throughout the broadcast, by all means, if you're in the chat room with me tonight live, by all means, you can place your comments or questions, and I will attend to them at certain points during the reading. So I want to scrutinize the doctrine that is often thought to be a component of both conceptions of black solidarity. Collective identity theory, a collective black identity, is essential for an effective black solidarity, whose aim is liberation from racial oppression. Therefore, blacks who are committed to emancipatory group solidarity must embrace and preserve their distinctive black identity. It is perhaps obvious why the advocate of black collective self-determination would embrace this view, since it is a distinctive social identity of blacks that, on this account, constitutes them as a people. Without such an identity, the goal of black collective self-realization loses its rationale and much of its appeal. But even for those who accept the more modest common oppression theory, collective identity theory may seem to have much going for it, as it would appear to help with overcoming two serious obstacles to black collective action against anti-black racism. First, there is the familiar free rider program. While some blacks are willing to take the relevant sacrifices to bring about social equality, others are much more complacent and narrowly interested. That's true. Free riders, I like that term. The inaction of the latter weakens the collective effort, and it breeds resentment and suspicion among blacks, as some are seen as benefiting from the sacrifices of others without contributing anything of substance to the collective struggle. Collective identity theory suggests a partial solution. By cultivating a common conception of who they are as Black people, Blacks can strengthen the bonds of sympathy and loyalty that will enable them to overcome these barriers to collective action. Such an identity could also give Blacks a firmer basis for mutual identification across class lines, something that is thought to be sorely needed in this time of increasing intra-racial economic stratification. Second, there is the general problem that the mere acceptance of abstract principles of justice is often insufficient to motivate people to contribute the time and resources necessary for effecting meaningful social change. This difficulty affects the collective will of Blacks as well, despite the fact that they, perhaps more than any other racialized group in America, desperately want to see an end to racial oppression. Again, the collective identity theory seems to help viewing each other as Black brothers and sisters with a shared social identity may, like the familiar motivating force of kinship relations, make Blacks more inclined to help each other in a movement to end racial subordination and equality. Many influential theorists in the history of Black political thought have defended or relied upon the collective identity theory. All right. The tendency to tie emancipatory Black solidarity to the need for a collective Black identity can be found in the writings and speeches of such diverse thinkers as Edward Blyden, Alexander Crummell, W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, Alan Locke, Malcolm X, Amiri Baraka, Harold Cruz, Stokely Carmichael, Maulana Karenga, Molefi Asante, and Lucius Outlaw. For purposes of illustrating this tendency, I will focus on Du Bois and his well-known essay, The Conservation of Races. In that essay, Du Bois explicitly advocates a particularly strong form of emancipatory Black solidarity. Quote, "It is our, the American Negroes, duty to conserve our physical powers, our intellectual endowments, and spiritual ideals. As a race, we must strive to be we must strive by race organization, by race solidarity, by race unity, to the realization that broader humanity, which freely recognizes differences in men, but sternly deprecates inequality in the opportunities of development." End of quote. Du Bois believed that Black solidarity is necessary for both overcoming racial oppression and ensuring that Blacks make their unique cultural contribution to humanity. He also insisted that Blacks should conserve their racial identity, rather than be absorbed into Anglo-American culture for, as he saw it, the goals of emancipatory Black solidarity cannot be achieved without the preservation of a distinct Black identity. Quote, "We believe it the duty of Americans of Negro descent as a body to maintain their race identity until this mission of the Negro people is accomplished, and the ideal of a human brotherhood has become practical possibility." Right, so already we see, again, I'm not doing too much commentary, but we know Du Bois is an accommodationist. He's an integrationist of sorts. And, his mindset is encapsulated in that statement. Let's keep a Black identity, and then once we integrate, we don't have to have a Black identity. While it is clear that Du Bois would like to see Black identity preserved even beyond that time when, if ever, social equality becomes a reality, that's not really true. Here he emphasizes the duty of Blacks to maintain their identity until such equality is realized. Even in his reconstruction of the concept of race, Du Bois emphasized the link between racial identity and race solidarity. Quote, a race is a vast family of human beings, generally of common blood and language, always of common history, traditions, and impulses, who are both voluntary and involuntarily striving together for the accomplishment of certain more or less vividly conceived ideals of life. Do you guys agree with that definition of race from W.E.B. Du Bois? Do you guys agree, yes or no, with that description? In the chat room, I see we got the pro-black perspective. He says, yeah, tired of Du Bois. Yeah, I am too. Right? It's amazing how often Du Bois comes up in these type of discussions, and it always makes me think back to Malcolm X telling us, you know, be wary of the people that they continuously throw at you, right? Recently, there has been a lively philosophical debate over the exact meaning of Du Bois's conception of race as defined in his conservation essay. Much of this debate has focused on the metaphysics of race, that is, on what races are, whether any really exists, and if so, in what sense. Du Bois was no doubt concerned with such questions, but his interest in the reality of race of races was in part based on his desire to lay a firm foundation for black solidarity. Du Bois was convinced that a collective black identity, based primarily on a shared history and culture, and only secondarily on a common biology, is a necessary component of an emancipatory black solidarity. So he put biology second. Okay. Much of black social thought has followed him in this. All right. Much of black social thought has followed him in this. Indeed, among advocates of black solidarity, collective identity theory is often treated as a truism. However, I will argue that we should reject this view of black emancipation, not because black solidarity has no contribution to make to black liberation, but rather because cultivating a collective black identity is unnecessary for forging effective bonds among blacks. Would create or exacerbate an already undue constraint on individual freedom, and is likely in any case to be self-defeating. Okay. Let me read that one more time. However, I will argue that we should reject this view of black emancipation, not because black solidarity has no contribution to make to black liberation, but rather because cultivating a collective black identity is unnecessary for forging effective bonds among blacks, would create or exacerbate an already undue constraint on individual freedom. It's likely in any case to be self-defeating. You guys agree with that statement? I see in the chat room, the pro-black perspective says the Malcolm X quote is facts. Yep, I agree. I would argue that disentangle the call for an emancipatory black solidarity from the call for a collective black identity. A black solidarity that is based on the common experience of anti-black racism and a joint commitment to bringing it to an end can and should play an important role in the fight against racial injustice. The thing is, though, my disagreement with this author is that we really shouldn't be fighting to end so-called racism. You know, we should be building solidarity to create our own power base, our own power structure. And in that, we challenge racism, we match it, right? But an emancipatory black solidarity that emphasizes the need to affirm a racial, ethnic, cultural, and or national identity is a legacy of black political thought that must now be abandoned for the sake of the struggle against racial oppression. Toward the end of this essay, I will sketch and defend a version of the common oppression theory that eschews the requirement of a collective Black identity. Before proceeding further, however, two caveats are in order. First, my concern in this essay is with that form of group solidarity that has as its primary goal the liberation of Black people from the burdens of racial inequality and anti-Black racism. Thus, for the remainder of this essay, Black solidarity will refer to this type of emancipatory solidarity. But of course, not everything that could rightly be called a form of Black solidarity is bound up with anti-racist politics, since there are other collective goals or values that could serve as a basis for building Black unity. For instance, there is a form of Black solidarity that has as its end the nurturing of communal relationships among Blacks, a solidarity that is not treated as a means to some other external objective. Some may seek solidarity with other Blacks simply because they see intrinsic value in the social interaction and the feelings of community that it brings. Nothing I say here should be taken to preclude or disparage this type of solidarity. The form of emancipatory Black solidarity that I would defend is perfectly compatible with it. Indeed, under certain conditions, the former may even, without conscious effort, foster the latter, and vice versa. Second, like Du Bois, some Blacks might want to work together to cultivate and preserve Black culture because they believe it to be distinctive, intrinsically valuable, and in danger of being lost or underappreciated. And again, they may see this collective project as important, quite apart from its relationship to the struggle against racism. Provided such a project is not treated as a necessary component of emancipatory Black solidarity, it is not threatened by the rejection of the collective identity theory. However, if Blacks are thought to have an obligation to commit themselves to this goal of cultural conservation, then the project will be vulnerable to some of the criticisms I will raise against collective identity theory below. For those of you live with me, there's a few of you here, what are your early thoughts on this paper and the direction that this writer is going to be writing in? So that brings us to this section called Group Solidarity. Before submitting it to critical scrutiny, it will be useful to specify the collective identity theory in a bit more detail. This will involve two tasks: explaining the meaning of Blackness and describing the requirements of solidarity. I will take up the latter task first. I want to suggest that there are 4 core characteristics that are jointly sufficient for a robust form of group solidarity. By robust here, I mean a solidarity that is strong enough to move people to collective action, and not just a mutual sympathy born of the recognition of commonality or feel-good sense of group belonging. Okay. So first is the identification between group members. One of the more salient characteristics of group solidarity is the tendency of group members to identify with each other or with the group as a whole. The basis of mutual identification can vary greatly. It can, for example, be based on a shared ethnic or cultural heritage, whether real or imagined. But its basis may also be the fact that group members believe themselves to share a similar plight or some significant, perhaps life-shaping experience. Such commonality often engenders mutual empathetic understanding. This kind of understanding is not, however, merely a manner of sympathy, which may be nothing more than an involuntary reaction to the plight of others. Rather, members of a solidarity group come to view themselves because of what they have in common as sharing a special bond. Because of this bond, sometimes fellow group members are treated as if they are an extension of the self, so that one may feel pride when a member of the group does something praiseworthy, or shame when a fellow member does something embarrassing, almost as if one had done the deed oneself. You know, side note, this has been a thought of mine that's been bubbling under the surface for a while. Something that we do, and we saw it a lot during the ADOS FBA moments, right? Where you look at, you'll see a group, and I'm not saying just ADOS does it. I think all groups do it to some extent. But you'll see like one person does something, and everyone from that group, you know, takes it to represent the whole, right? So it's like the whole group did it. But that's not, in reality, that's not really how things work. Yeah, it's cool that, you know, it's cool that, say, you know, one guy created a what you call a global translator device, right? That would be cool, but can you really place that on the group? Now, again, going back to the idea of communalism, you do something, it lifts me up as well, right? That's the idea. But I see where, you know, there's some groups who completely take the actions or the activities of a person and make that, you know, the status quo of the entire group. And I think that there's something to that we got to stop doing. There's an aspect of that. Again, I understand communalism, but there's an aspect of that we have to stop taking the actions of one and kind of spreading it across the whole sometimes. I think we need to discern that a little bit better. It is mutual identification that accounts for this familiar sense of we-ness that is so characteristic of solidarity groups. Then the other characteristic is shared values or goals. Members of a solidarity group share a set of values and or goals, and each knows, or at least believes, that fellow group members are committed to these. The values or goals might take the form of more or less vague ideals. For example, Africa for the Africans, or Black Power. Is Africa for the Africans a vague ideal? Is Black Power a vague ideal? I'm not too sure about that. Specific? No, I mean, I guess when you gotta start calling into question what is an African, you know, maybe it's vague in that sense. The values or goals might take the form of more or less vague ideals, for example, Africa for the Africans or Black Power. Specific policies or principles, for example, civil disobedience or equal opportunity for all, or broad social programs, example, Black capitalism, or the building of a unified African nation state. Such common values and or goals often, at least partially, define the group, constituting its distinctive character, self-conception. That's an interesting section, by the way. Right? The shared values or goals. Does the African have the same shared values as the African of the Caribbean or the African of America? You know, and that's something we need to really start to address more. Group loyalty. One of the most important components of a solidarity is group loyalty. Loyalty to one's group entails allowing the group to figure significantly in the construction of one's projects and life plans. Actually like that. This will involve, perhaps among other things, faithfulness to the group's values, principles, and ideals, and a willingness to exert extra effort to help members of the group and to advance the group's interests. Moreover, group loyalty is always, at least somewhat, exclusionary and is often defined in opposition to some other groups. That is, there's usually an us and a them, or if you like, an in-group and an out-group. Members of a solidarity group show loyalty to in-group members as opposed to those of the relevant out-group, whose interests, goals, or values may differ from or conflict with those of the in-group. Though it does require that one be willing to resist threats to one's group created by its enemies, the partiality that loyalty engenders need not be adversarial, and that's an important thing to remember. Understand who your real enemy is. They should be the out group. A black man, black woman from the continent, from the Caribbean, from America, from the UK, from South America, all of those people should be in the in group. Peaceful coexistence, even coalition between different solidarity groups is often possible. So that brings us to mutual trust. Group solidarity also requires that group members trust one another, for mutual trust is the foundation of cooperation. Because of the vulnerability to exploitation that loyalty engenders, well-founded trust is necessary to give group members some measure of security. Each must have reason to believe that the others will not let him down, betray the values of the group, or free ride on the sacrifices of his fellows. Mutual trust enables members of the group to act collectively to achieve group goals, especially when success is uncertain. There are many examples of solidarity groups: families, labor unions, fraternities and sororities, some ethnic groups, religious organizations, political parties, police officers, street gangs, military personnel, and organized crime syndicates. Rather than focus on any of these quite complicated and with some of these problematic forms of solidarity, a simpler and more suitably paradigmic case is the solidarity between members of a sports team. Players on a sports team often identify with each other. When they do, each thinks in terms of we rather than I. Unless you're playing with Michael Jordan. When the team wins a game, all rejoice in victory, and when it loses, everyone suffers the agony of defeat. No matter how much or little each may have contributed to the victory or loss. Some sports teams will also be jointly committed to a set of values or goals. For example, they may be committed to fair play and sportsmanship, a particular style of play, or a win-at-all-costs philosophy. Team solidarity also requires that each be loyal to the group's values and to her teammates. So, for instance, members of the team will work hard during practice sessions, stick to agreed-upon game plans, put aside individual goals when pursuing them with conflict with the good of the team, and expend as much effort as is necessary for the team to win. The sports cliches quote 110%. Finally, members of a sports team must trust one another, especially if they are to be successful at winning. Each must feel confident that her teammates will perform their designated roles on the team, and each must know that if she makes an honest mistake that costs the team a game, her teammates will support her with words of encouragement rather than berate and blame her. Such trust is often built by mutual displays of individual loyalty to the team or by repeatedly struggling together against formidable opponents. To briefly summarize, robust group solidarity exists whenever a set of individuals identify with each other, are jointly committed to certain values or goals, are loyal to the group and its members and trust one another. Thus, black solidarity would be robust if blacks as a group were to possess each of these 4 characteristics. And for you guys listening live or listen to the playback, either way, drop a comment on what you feel about, you know, these group of, you know, these 4 characteristics if you want to see robust black solidarity. That brings us to a section called Varieties of Black Social Identity. According to collective identity theory, black people must embrace and preserve their distinctive black identity if a politically progressive solidarity is to flourish among them. To fully understand this position, then, we also need to know what group of people, black, is supposed to be picking out here. What the nature of this black identity is that they must embrace and preserve. You know, as I get ready to read this, if you're in the chat room or what have you, you know, drop what you think black is. Like, what is the black identity? I want to approach these 2 questions by making a distinction between thin and thick conceptions of black identity. Relying on this distinction, we will see, among other things, that the collective identity theorist urges the cultivation of thick black identity. On a thin conception of black identity, black is a vague and socially imposed category of difference that serves to distinguish groups on the basis of their members having certain visible, inherent physical characteristics and or particular biological ancestry. The prevailing thin conception of black identity in the United States holds that blacks are those persons who have inherited physical traits as dark skin, tightly curled or kinky hair, a broad flat nose, and thick lips, and are those persons who are descendants of people that were presumed to have such characteristics. Thus, on a thin view, blacks are persons who, more or less, fit a certain phenotypic profile, and or who are thought to have biological ancestors that fit the relevant profile. Okay, I don't mind that. That's the thin conception. Okay. In the chat room, KW Dawn 7, once again, peace to you, brother. KW Dawn is a gold status supporter at this point. He says that you cannot have solidarity with the collective and be married to an alien. Yeah, absolutely. I.e. Kwame Nkrumah, Sheikh Anta Diop, Frantz Fanon, to name a few. You know, I'm always really perplexed by particularly Sheikh and Nkrumah, right? I'm always particularly perplexed by those guys and that aspect of them, right? But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't read their work. We shouldn't try to understand what they were saying, right? Eat the flesh and spit out the bone type stuff. But you're right, KW Dawn. This idea of marrying the out group and still thinking that your voice should be heard, for example, in the in group, is utter nonsense. For those who meet the criteria, there is little room for choice. You cannot simply decide not to be thinly black, as the African American saying goes. Quote, the only thing I have to do is stay black and die. End of quote. If, say, one were to assimilate completely to so-called white culture, one's thin blackness would nevertheless remain intact, for cultural conversion provides no escape. Cultural conversion provides no escape. No amount of wealth or social status can erase one's thin blackness. though clearly one's class status might mitigate some of its negative consequences. One might alter her physical appearance so as not to look black, or if she does not have a black appearance, she might simply conceal her black ancestry, as those who quote-unquote pass do. But in either case, she would still be black, in the thin sense, even if never found out. It is an individual's thin blackness that makes her vulnerable to anti-black racism, despite her non-black physical appearance, her law-abiding conduct and good character, her class position or professional status, or the extent of her assimilation to the dominant white culture. That brings to mind this lady, god damn it, what's her name again? She used to be on the Love Boat all the time. If you guys are old enough to remember the Love Boat, you remember this. She was old then. This lady, and she was always singing hello Dolly, hello darling, or hello Dolly, whatever the fuck it was. Carol Channing. You know, she was actually, from what I understand, she was actually black, right? She actually had black parents, but she had a father that was a passing black person. A fit conception of black identity, which usually includes a thin criterion as a component part, always requires something more or something other than a common physical appearance or shared ancestry. Here, the social category black has a narrower social meaning, with specific and sometimes quite demanding criteria for who qualifies as black. Drawing on a history of black social thought, 4 familiar versions of thick blackness can be distinguished. First, relying on K. Anthony Appiah's terminology, there is the racialist conception of blackness. On this conception, black identity is based on the supposed presence of a special genotype in the biological makeup of all fully black people that does not exist among non-blacks. On this view, an underlying cluster of genes transmitted through reproduction accounts not only for the relatively superficial physical traits that constitute thin blackness, but also for more socially significant traits such as temperament, aesthetic sensibility, and certain innate talents. And it is the possession of this genotype that defines membership in the black race. There is, of course, a racialist conception of blackness that is committed to the view that biological race determines native intelligence, reproductive traits and tendencies, and moral character. However, since this strong form of racial determinism is widely accepted as false and racially offensive, I will assume that our collective identity theorist does not endorse it. Second, there is the ethnic conception of blackness. It treats black identity as a matter of shared ancestry and common cultural heritage. On such an account, there is no assumption that two people of the same ethnicity must necessarily share the same racial essence. To be sure, the members of an ethnic group may share certain physical traits as a result of their shared biological ancestry, for example, dark skin or the capacity to grow an afro. And they may even value their possession of these traits as part of their ethnic heritage. But these ethnic traits need not be viewed as indicating an underlying racial genotype that explains black behavioral or psychological dispositions. Indeed, the ethnic conception of blackness is consistent with the complete rejection of racialism. That's interesting. Okay. There are two dominant ethnic conceptions of black identity. One emphasizes the fact that black people are descendants of certain sub-Saharan African peoples. and it maintains that they share a culture that is traceable to the culture of those ancestors. The other stresses both the experiences of blacks with oppression in the New World and the rich culture they have created in the context of that oppression since being forcibly removed from Africa. On both versions, though, one does not have a black ethnic identity unless one both has the relevant biological ancestry and embraces the appropriate cultural traits. Third, there is the cultural conception of blackness. It rests on the claim that there is an identifiable ensemble of beliefs, values, behaviors, and practices that has come to be associated with the thinly black because of their role in creating it. Though this culture is thought to be primarily a product of thinly black people and their experiences, its continued reproduction does not depend solely on the activities of these blacks, since non-blacks may participate in sustaining and developing it as well. Jazz, for example. Oh boy. On this model, thin black identity is tied neither to race nor to biological ancestry. Anyone could, in principle, embrace and cultivate a black cultural identity in much the same way that anyone could, again, in principle, become a practicing Christian. This is where some of the nonsense we have in our black society comes from. Finally, there is a historically influential kinship conception of blackness. This view understands black identity on the model of the family. Recall Du Bois's conception of race as a vast family, or consider the use of brother and sister to affectionately refer to fellow blacks. Of course, blacks are not a family, not even an extended one, in other ordinary sense. So what is it about familial relations that could plausibly constitute a basis or suggest an analogous foundation for a thick black identity? There seem to be three possibilities. First, one could understand blackness in terms of biological relatedness, that is, blood ties, but then the kinship conception can be expressed in terms of the racialist view, the ethnic view, or the thin conception of black identity. Second, one could treat black identity as not merely a matter of biology, but of the reproduction of a common way of life. But here I would suggest the idea could be adequately captured by the ethnic conception of blackness, perhaps with some additional racialist assumptions. Or third, like familial relations formed through marriage or adoption, blackness could be thought to rest on voluntary affiliation, custom, or even legal convention. You know, a long time ago, I remember where you know, I was hanging out in these Rastafari camps and stuff, and I'd show up and there's a white boy or a white woman heavy on the scene, right? And I remember times, because you know, I have locks, I remember times being on the train and a white woman would, you know, this one time in particular, this white woman hails me up, so to speak, and she said in a full, you know, Jamaican patois, so the bedroom ain't gonna hail me up, hey bitch, I'm sorry, lady, if you don't get the fuck away from me, like, nah. But that's the thing that we do. We have this belief that people could be adopted into black. Not all of us, but some of us have this belief that people could be adopted into blackness, right? And it's wild that we allow that to be a thing, right? This form of blackness, however, would be simply a version of the cultural conception. Thus, the familiar kinship view is not a distinct conception of blackness from the ones already considered, and thus it will not receive independent critical discussion here. In the chat room, there's some activity. KW Don 7 says black is synonymous with African. Those who have African textured hair, brown to dark brown skin complexion. You would have to look like our ancestors prior to miscegenation. That's a great point. Prior to miscegenation, prior to being dominated as well, right? The pro-black perspective says, LOL, anyone can be black. Oh, I know. He says anyone can be black head ass. Yeah, I mean, come on. Like, KW Don 7 goes on to say, what did Africans look like 250,000 years ago? What do the majority of Africans look like on the continent in the present day? And see, that's the thing about when you lose ground, man. When you lose ground, remember the old saying that, you know, the victor is the one who writes history, right? So, you know, a couple years ago, and I've talked about this in the show before, I like to repeat things if you haven't noticed, but there was this movie called Gods of Egypt. And the guy who owns Fox, Rupert Murdoch, I think that's his name, yeah, Rupert Murdoch, he said when people were slamming it, right, after like the first preview or something came out, people were slamming it, and Rupert Murdoch says, well, all the Egyptians I know are white. Which, by the way, goes to tell you something about the Arab, right? Well, he said all the Egyptians I know are white. And which, you know, that is something that's more so a recent thing, right? Comparatively speaking, if you go back hundreds of thousands of years ago, right? Who would you see? You know, you'd probably see, if you're black, your doppelganger, right? And so that's the thing about losing ground. And that's the thing about not doing the work to regain some ground. Now, now a lot of people have done the work, you know, but have they done the work in a significant enough way to really make it mainstream thought? And is it even possible to make it, you know, to make the truth of things mainstream thought? To continue, there are several things to notice about thin and thick black identities. First, one may choose with varying degrees of difficulty not to define one's self-conception in terms of blackness at all. That is, one may choose not to subjectively identify with the label black or to conform to its associated behavioral norms. Some contend that those blacks who do so are denying something important about themselves, perhaps out of racially motivated self-hate. But a different, more respectable reason for rejecting a black identity, one that does not necessarily involve self-deception, is that one may believe the designation black, with its typical connotations, is not an apt characterization of either who one is or who one would like to be. Well, that's just Sambo talk right there. That's some stuff I expect Thomas Sowell or someone to say. Or one might think that a black identity, while perhaps perfectly appropriate for some, is too crude or limiting in one's own case. Yet another reason might be that one believes it to be an inherently invidious and repressive social distinction, and thus should be repudiated on political grounds. It should be clear, however, that the choice not to self-identify as black, whatever its rationale, does not dissolve the often constraining social realities that are created by the fact that others may insist on ascribing such an identity to one, and consequently may treat one accordingly, whether for good or ill. And that's a good landing point that the author is making. Dude, fella, lady, try as you may, they're gonna see you as black. And like I've said on social media in the past, like the funny thing is that, all these Europeans or Eurasians or whatever, they see a black person, they know exactly where you from. They know you're African. That's the crazy part. But here we are, folks arguing not to be black or not to be African or whatever. These folks know it though, and treat you in kind, right? Second, given the thin-thick distinction, we can understand what it would mean to say of someone who is clearly black, according to thin criteria, but who fails to satisfy the relevant criteria for thick blackness, whatever that turns out to be, that he or she isn't really black. A claim that is sometimes thought to be somewhat paradoxical, if not completely incoherent. Here's how we might make sense of the familiar charge within the context of thinking about the relevance of a collective identity for black solidarity. Though a person cannot choose whether to be black in the thin sense, she can, as we've said, decide what significance she will attach to her thin blackness. This includes deciding whether to commit herself to emancipatory black solidarity, but if she does so commit, then she could rightly be criticized for failing to live up to obligations she has accepted as a member of that solidarity group. For example, she might be criticized for not being sufficiently loyal to other blacks fighting for racial equality. Now, I don't see a problem with that criticism. I think every black person, man, woman, boy, girl, needs to be on the same page as to fighting for power, right? Building a nation, etc. And I think you should, I think you can, and you should be called up, right? If you're black and you're proud, then you need to be doing the work of someone who's black and proud. If we understand authenticity, not as a matter of acting in conformity to or fully realizing one's extravolational essence, but as a matter of being faithful to one's chosen principles for action, then for our purposes, black inauthenticity would be a matter of not living up to one's solidaristic commitment, whatever that entails. Thus, if the goals of black solidarity cannot be achieved without a thick collective black identity, as collective identity theory maintains, then a person who has signed on to this emancipatory project but fails to accept and act in accordance with the relevant thick identity can rightly be criticized for being inauthentic. So would we consider Nkrumah, Diop, Fanon as inauthentic? That's my question to the chat room. Would we consider those folks inauthentic? By using the thin-thick distinction, then, we can more clearly discuss the politics of black authenticity and its role in black solidarity. Finally, it is clear that many who satisfy the criteria for thin blackness spontaneously embrace a thick black identity without treating this as a conscious strategy, and with little or no regard for how this affects anti-racist politics. For those who do deliberately choose to cultivate a thick black identity, they do so for the most varied reasons. some having to do with resisting anti-black racism, some having more to do with cultivating self-esteem, wanting a rich and relatively stable conception of who they are, or desiring a strong sense of community. I already know the answer, but for you guys who are on with me live, what do you consider yourself? Thin or thick blackness? All right? If you're going to be in, you got to be in all the way, man. You know? Moreover, it is probably rare that blacks consciously embrace a thick black identity for purely political purposes. Indeed, in order for such an identity to have a positive effect on black solidarity, blacks may need to embrace it on grounds apart from its political value. The collective identity theorist should concede all this, but she would insist that were a sufficient number of blacks, for whatever reason, to reject or distance themselves from thick blackness, this would seriously hamper, if not undermine, emancipatory black solidarity. And there's truth to that, absolutely, especially when given the collective action problems that blacks currently face. Indeed, the familiar policing of social identities that takes place among black Americans, which often annoys those who seek more freedom in the construction of their social identities, arguably functions to strengthen the bonds of solidarity necessary for effective resistance against racial oppression. It is for this reason that the advocate of collective identity theory urges blacks to accept a thick black identity, even if many will do so for reasons have little to do with anti-racism. In chat room, KW Dawn 7 says, anyone who has studied real world history knows that the Pale Arab invaded Kemet around 640 AD. Rupert Murdoch is full of shit. He participates in the mass media propaganda machine against Africa. Yeah, he absolutely does. You know? And that statement he made around the time of that movie is proof of that. It's not that we were not that the thick blacks wouldn't have already known that by that time, right? But you're right. And so because but to KW Dawn's point, just to add it to a previous point I made, because we lost that, because there's that gap now, right? We've lost that, and we don't have a way, right? We don't have a mass media propaganda machine of our own that can counter that narrative, right? Because I truly believe, call me naive if you will, I truly believe if most of these youths who are fighting, doing the infighting in the gangs in the streets, if they had learned from early on their pantheon of gods, their deities, learn about Kemet and stuff as a youth, through stories and parables and quotes and whatnot, I believe a great number of those youth wouldn't have gone down that path. So I bring this back to the education, right? I'll admit, when I was a kid, I used to love some Greek mythology, because the stories were interesting, they had a little moral to them and stuff like that. But what would it have been like as a kid to have, stories of our own pantheon of gods? Right? I mean, yeah. Given the above distinctions and caveats, the collective identity theory can be given a more precise formulation. There are persons who meet the criteria for thin blackness who also have available to them a black identity that is deeper, that is thicker than their thin blackness. and these persons must positively affirm and preserve their thick blackness if collectively they are to overcome their racial oppression through group solidarity. Thus, for the remainder of this discussion, when I speak of the alleged need for a common black identity, I will be using black in the thick sense. When I speak of black people, or simply blacks, I will mean black in the thin sense. Okay, hold on. Let me make sure I could remember this. So when she uses black in the thick sense, wait, hold on. I'll be using black in the thick sense, okay? When I speak of black people, okay, or simply blacks, plural, I will mean blacks in the thin sense. She could have done a better job at that, but okay. So black means the thick sense, blacks or black people is the thin sense. Okay, got it. Against collective identity theory, this is the next section that we've arrived to. On a racialist conception of blackness, with his commitment to a more than skin-deep racial essence, embracing and preserving black identity, which seemed to entail, at a minimum, fostering intraracial reproduction between blacks, and perhaps more important, discouraging interracial reproduction between blacks and non-blacks. The practice of racial endogamy, right, is supported to help keep the black essence intact and protect blacks from the dangers of racial hybridity. However, this view has a number of problems. For one thing, it is now generally acknowledged that no pure races exist. Indeed, many biologists and anthropologists question the existence of human races altogether. But even if there are, or once were, pure racial groups, those who are black by thin criteria certainly will not qualify as one, or even a proper subset thereof, since many, by some estimates as many as 80%, have some European or Native American ancestry. Limiting black solidarity to only pure or purer blacks would exclude many victims of anti-black racism, contrary to the point of the enterprise, and will run the risk of creating a kind of reverse color prejudice. That is, a preference for darker skin rather than the more familiar light skin preference among those who identify or are identified as black. So there's a thought I've heard before that the one of the moves that black folks should make in procreating is to procreate with darker skinned blacks, in an attempt, I assume, to excise, whatever European genetic influences there are in creating lighter skinned black folks. What do you guys thought on that? Given the history of so-called miscegenation in this country, a politics of black racial purity would almost certainly undermine emancipatory black solidarity. A racialist justification for the policy of black endogamy would be no more plausible if the more inclusive one-drop rule for blackness were adopted. That is, the rule that says that if a person has any black ancestors, that she is black. Such a conception of black identity would hardly justify prohibiting race mixing in the name of black solidarity. If anything, it suggests that blacks should make it their policy to produce mixed progeny, since this will only increase their numbers, consequently their collective strength. What? Now, let me read that again. A racialist justification for the policy of black endogamy would be no more plausible if the more inclusive one-drop rule for blackness were adopted. That is, the rule that says that if a person has any black ancestors, then she is black. Such a conception of black identity would hardly justify prohibiting race mixing in the name of black solidarity. Anything, it suggests that blacks should make it their policy to produce mixed progeny, since this would only increase their numbers and consequently their collective strength. Wow. Given the obvious problems with its racialist version, most advocates of the collective identity theory have adopted the more plausible position that blacks should embrace and preserve their distinctive ethnic and cultural identity. The main difference between these two conceptions of blackness, recall, is that the ethnic version emphasizes black ancestry, while the cultural version does not. But since collective identity theory calls on blacks to embrace their thick black identity, those who do so will turn out to have the appropriate ancestry by default. Thus, for present purposes at least, ethnic and cultural versions of collective identity theory come to the same thing. The remainder of this section, therefore, will treat the ethnic and cultural versions of collective identity theory together. Though they differ on its precise content and boundaries, both the ethnic and cultural versions of collective identity theory require blacks to identify with black culture, insisting that blacks view it as, at least partly, constitutive of who they are as individuals and as a group. Note, though, that if this cultural identity is to have a positive effect on black solidarity, providing a basis for mutual identification, reinforcing common values and goals, and creating stronger bonds of loyalty and trust, then it can't be merely a passive or subjective acknowledgement of the value of black culture. Rather, blacks must actively perform their thick blackness for other blacks, and perhaps non-blacks, to see. They must demonstrate their knowledge of black culture and their appreciation of its value by participating in it, preserving or developing it, exposing others to it, especially their children, and in general, allowing it to be a significant influence on their lives. I can get behind that. That's a word right there. There was a strong and weak version of the ethnic cultural view. On the strong version, a collective black ethnic cultural identity is a necessary component of black solidarity. That is, blacks must share a common ethnic or cultural identity if emancipatory black solidarity is to flourish. Failing to cultivate such a collective identity would, according to the strong view, undermine the effort to build black unity. I like that. On the weak version, a collective black identity is not claimed to be necessary for black solidarity, which blacks might get by without one, but it is thought that such an identity would nevertheless strengthen the bonds of black unity by giving them more in common than just a history of oppression. However, I don't think either version is sound. Focusing on the strong version first, I will argue that there is little reason to suppose that blacks must share a collective identity in order for them to exhibit, as a group, each of the four characteristics of robust solidarity outlined above. At the outset, it might be thought that if blacks are to identify with each other, they must share an ethnic or cultural identity, or at least they must believe themselves to share such an identity. However, there are clearly other and more reliable bases for identification. For example, blacks could identify with each other because they believe themselves to suffer the same form of racial subordination, to have experienced the degradation and insult of anti-black racism, or to share common interests in ending racial equality. So this is where, this author sounds like she's serving soft serve ice cream. right? But let's continue. The mutual recognition of such commonality could produce, and clearly already has produced, empathetic understanding of a deeply felt kind between blacks. Thus quite apart from their supposed common racial characteristics, ethnicity, or culture, each could come to see and feel that a significant part of herself or himself is to be found in the others, so that it becomes meaningful to speak about the act, to speak about and act on the basis of what we experience, we believe, and we desire. So, okay. On one hand, it is true that because of culture and cultural differences, right? That could prevent us from, really harmonizing our efforts. Although I will say that the truth of the matter is, those differences are mostly or tend to be somewhat superficial. Oftentimes, when you look deeper at the so-called cultural differences, as a matter of fact, wherever you might see a legit cultural difference, there's like 10 cultural similarities. I saw a clip, and I always mean to include it in the show to show how idiotic some of this stuff is. There's a clip of Tariq Nasheed that I have, where he recently was talking about we could tell, we being Black Americans can tell you're an African by your hairline and all this whole, just real silly dumb stuff. And if you let the silly dumb stuff come in between, then there will be no harmonization in our efforts, right? Again, for every difference there is, there's a dozen or more similarities, and we should focus on the similarities more. I get where the academic and his author is coming from, but ultimately, like I said, a lot of that stuff is more or less superficial, and where it is legit, again, you could find dozens of other similarities, okay? In fact, often members of a subordinate group suffer a common fate because of a social identity that they only appear to share, for it is not uncommon for a dominant group to construct an identity for those it oppresses and for itself in order to justify the ill treatment and deplorable conditions of the subordinate group. And some of us, as African people, we play into this stuff, right? You'll have an African from Ghana who might believe that he or she is better than, an African from the diaspora, right? But a lot of times that's because in some form or another, they're being kind of told to see themselves as different or better. Such imputed social identities are sometimes entirely fictional, maliciously fabricated by oppressor groups. For example, consider the view that blacks are the descendants of Ham and thus are forever cursed to toil for the benefit of whites. But even when the ascribed identity is based in something real, the subordinate group may still find it more practical to build solidarity on the basis of their common oppression and their desire to overcome it. For not all of its members may value or identify with the ascription. Black solidarity certainly requires a shared set of values and goals. But this normative commitment need not involve embracing anything we might want to call Black culture. One doesn't have to possess a Black cultural identity. Indeed, one doesn't have to be Black at all in order to appreciate the value of racial equality or to condemn racism. boy. Of course, values are a component of culture, and black cultural forms are among those that sometimes express or embody principles of social equality, which can be a legitimate source of black pride. Nevertheless, the basis of blacks' commitment to equality is surely that this is what justice demands, not that such values are embedded in black cultural tradition. Black culture did not extol the virtues of racial justice, but instead emphasized black supremacy, or worse yet, black inferiority, then blacks would of course need to reject this component of their culture and embrace social equality instead, whatever his cultural roots. Loyalty too can exist between blacks with diverse ethnic cultural identities. Consider, for example, the loyalty that sometimes exists between the diverse members of labor organizations. Despite differences in age, race, gender, religion, ethnicity, occupation, and many other things, some workers have at times been intensely loyal to one another, especially when confronted with threatening or dire circumstances. And they often maintain this loyalty with little more in common than their shared vulnerability as workers and their will to improve their lot. There's no reason why blacks cannot do the same, but they too are vulnerable to a threatening social force, anti-black racism. Thus, black loyalty can be based on the need for mutual support in an anti-black social environment and a joint commitment to anti-racist politics. There are no friends, man. Get off of that. In the chat room, I see KW Don 7 says the pimp appears to be made man as the days go by. It also seems clear. KW Don 7, what's going on with the pimp? Let us know in the chat. It also seems clear that blacks can foster mutual trust among themselves without sharing a common black identity. Undoubtedly, a common ethnic or cultural identity would create a type of familiarity and ease of intercourse that could contribute to the building of mutual trust. And in general, it is probably easier to trust those with whom one shares a social identity. However, trust can be facilitated in other ways as well. For instance, one can demonstrate one's trustworthiness by openly making efforts to advance the cause of black liberation. However, trust can be facilitated in other ways as well. For instance, one can demonstrate one's trustworthiness by openly making efforts to advance the cause of black liberation. Is that enough though? Trust can also be fostered by working together with other blacks to accomplish limited short-term goals. For example, boycotting a known racist establishment or putting pressure on political leaders to heed black concerns. Right. So this part here actually ties into what we talked about with the unity and milestones and having what's the word? Not programs, but having I guess for lack of a better word, having these programs that build trust in the group. Right. And the key thing that we mentioned was the need for like short-term goals, right? Not these hollow, big, kind of rhetoric-filled goals, but short goals that lead up to or collectively, seeks to aim at a larger goal, right? This makes the participants only minimally vulnerable to one another, while at the same time creating seeds of trust that can grow through future collective efforts. In any case, using one's talents and resources to promote the goals and values of anti-racism is surely a better sign of one's trustworthiness in the struggle against racial oppression than expressing one's affiliation with other blacks by displaying one's black ethnic or cultural identity. So again, my edit to this would be check out the anti-racism and talk more about nation building, right? But again, I'm not nation building with no one who's not expressly black. So far, I have argued that a collective black identity, whether based on ethnicity or culture, is not a necessary condition for the creation and maintenance of a robust black solidarity. But as I mentioned earlier, some collective identity theorists endorse a slightly weaker position. Instead of claiming that a collective black identity is necessary, they claim that while perhaps not necessary for black solidarity, such an identity would create stronger bonds of black unity. However, the weak version is also unsound, as it is much more likely, at least presently, that the requirement of a common black identity would actually weaken black solidarity. There are a number of reasons for thinking this to be the case. Let's see what this is about. Let's see what this is about. For one thing, the push for a collective black identity would probably worsen existing intra-group antagonisms, and it might even produce new ones. The type of internal conflict among blacks that I have in mind would be likely to show up in at least 3 familiar domains. Okay, so we're talking intra-group antagonisms. First, black people would inevitably become bogged down, as they often have, by disagreements over what constitutes and who possesses an authentic black identity. Should blacks see themselves as essentially tied to Africa? And if so, what African culture or cultures should be given privileged status? Can this shared identity include elements from European and Anglo-American culture and still be authentically black? Or must it remain in some cases, in some sense, pure? Well, of course we don't want any European anything in the mix. How much, if any, of the cultural legacy of slavery, for example, Southern Negro folk culture, should blacks embrace? Should blacks from northern urban centers or those with a Southern sensibility as seen as more paradigmatically black? You know what? That raises a question. Do you guys know of an author that has some work out, book or whatever, video, DVD, that shows you the direct linkage between, say, Southern black culture or Black American culture right back to Africa? Right? Should black identity be tied to particular religious tradition? No. And if so, should this be Christianity, Islam, or some indigenous traditional African religion? Are there distinctively black norms of etiquette or black social values? Is there a black ethics, epistemology, or aesthetic? Are there uniquely black styles of dress, hairstyles, or modes of speech? Well, some of these are perhaps interesting questions. There is no reason to believe that blacks can achieve anything like consensus on such matters. That's the thing. And our discussion on unity kind of highlights this, right? Maybe there doesn't need to be consensus per se. Like I posted recently, and I talked about this recently, black folks need to return to Africa, definitely. If you can do it physically for now. But definitely you should return in other ways, in terms of your spirituality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? You could choose a culture. If you're out here and you can't trace, and nowadays you can kind of trace, I think, down to even your tribe, right? Go ahead and trace it. And then start doing your study, right? And the endless and often acrimonious disagreements between blacks over what constitutes authentic blackness can easily become so all-consuming that they lose sight of the sources of their anxiety about who they are. For example, anti-black racism, systematic social exclusion, persistent racial inequality, economic exploitation, and cultural imperialism, which should be the primary focus of their collective energies. Primary focus should be nation building. That takes care of most of what was listed there. Second, class differences among blacks will complicate any attempt to sustain a common black ethnic or cultural identity. First of all, it is not clear that wealthy blacks, the black middle class, and the black working or non-working poor share cultural traits that they do not also share with many non-blacks. Moreover, for decades now, there has been an ongoing contest between the black middle class and the poorer blacks over who has the standing to define black identity. That is, over who is best positioned to have the authentic black experience and to represent the race. It is also clear that the growing physical separation of the black middle class from the black urban poor, the former sometimes living in the suburbs and the latter mainly in urban ghettos, is likely to exacerbate this conflict. Given the increasing intra-group stratification of blacks, the well-known correlation between class position, cultural identification, we can expect this internal struggle over the meaning of blackness to constitute and perhaps intensify. You know, one of the things here is that, you know, and this paper focuses on, you know, African Americans, so I get it. But what it doesn't really flesh out is that if you look at African Americans in terms of its proximity to European or Eurasian Americans or what have you, then you will see a lot of these problems, and you will get a lot of these problems, you know, these intra-racial problems. And I'm not saying that it will be perfect in a black nation, at least not outright, not to start with, because I come from a more or less black nation. But there is the differences between the upper class and the lower class, or what have you. And that's where the economics will have to smooth that out, bring things a little closer, or much closer, I should say. However, if blacks were to drop the requirement of a common black ethnic or cultural identity, which, as I've argued, is not necessary for the success of the emancipatory project, this might actually reduce the negative effects that class differences have on black solidarity. And third, the requirement of a common black identity would surely aggravate the antagonism between black men and women over the meaning of blackness as it relates to gender. Okay, let's hear this. Sorry, I'm just highlighting something here. Historically, the content of black identity, including gender roles and norms governing family structure, has largely been prescribed by black men. That is, when it wasn't being defined by other ideological and structural forces within the larger society. Most often leading to greater sacrifice and less freedom for black women. Moreover, the attempt to maintain a positive and cohesive group identity will likely have the effect, as it often has, of subordinating or ignoring the legitimate concerns of black women. Because black women are situated at the intersection of racial and gender oppression, they have experiences and interests that are peculiar to their complex social condition. But many black men fail to acknowledge or take seriously these gendered experiences and interests. I don't know if it's that, well, she said many. I can't speak for all black men. I'm sure some do. I don't know, you know, how many I couldn't quantify it. But I do also know that, and something that's not spoken of a lot, is that black men, you know, and there's a few different circumstances for it, but black men really, really black women are the heads of black society. And again, there's different little reasons for that, and, you know, and we've talked about these things in the past, but for the most part, we don't really fight against it, if we're being honest. When black women voice, let alone attempt to aggressively deal with their political concerns, for example, rape, domestic violence and abuse, inequality and exploitation within the domestic sphere, sexual and reproductive freedom, gender discrimination and harassment on the job, access to political power and to positions of leadership, this is often seen as a divisive attempt to embarrass black men or as an imprudent move that threatens to worsen the public image of blacks. So I'll comment to that briefly and say that, first of all, it's not black men that are stopping that movement of, you know, or those movements of black women dealing with, you know, their political concerns. It's really not us doing it, right? It's those with the power who are doing it. And then secondly, the divisiveness, or what appears to be divisive, honestly, if you really pay attention to it, it is more so prompted and promoted by white folks. White folks get their adherents, right? And that's why you know, and their adherents are pushing this message that is black men. Remember the whole Jamel Hill bullshit about black men are the white supremacists of black society? You know, it's that type, or the countless root headlines. So it's that kind of thing that's kind of pushed by white society. You got some Negroes who pick it up, and then it becomes amplified again by white society and white media, white social media groups, etc. But honestly, and you guys can tell me in the comment section, do you have this dynamic in your relationships with the women in your lives? Are you embarrassed by black women trying to push for certain political rights or, you know, political concerns? I could tell you freely, it doesn't bother me. Rather than listening to black women and thinking of their concerns as integral to black freedom struggles, many black men have tried to silence black women and have remained complicit in the perpetuation of patriarchy. Here we go again. Often in the name of maintaining unity. Given the prevalence of sexist attitudes and behavior among black men and even some women, taken with the continuing unequal power relations between the sexes, male-centered conceptions of blackness are likely to dominate, though not, of course, without resistance. For example, witness the mixed reception of the Million Mile March among black Americans, especially black women. Though black feminist perspectives are growing in influence, even among some black men, until greater strides are made against black male hegemony, a shared and progressive view of what it means to be a thick black woman or man is unlikely to develop. However, all blacks, given their vulnerability to anti-black racial discrimination, have a vested interest in racial equality, regardless of their cultural leanings, class positions, or gender. Although the urgency with which one pursues racial justice will likely depend, among other things, on whether one also suffers under class exploitation, male domination, both or neither. Recognition of this common interest can lend motivational strength to a morally based joint commitment to ending racism. Frankly, it is doubtful that blacks will ever agree on the meaning of blackness, but they can and should agree to collectively resist racism, since it negatively affects them all, albeit to varying degrees and in different ways. Mobilizing and coordinating such collective efforts will be difficult enough without adding the unnecessary and divisive requirement that blacks embrace and preserve the distinctive ethnic or cultural identity. In the chat room, there's some activity. There's some activity. And again, I want to thank all you guys who've been jumping on, especially you guys who've been participating in the live chat. Again, like I always say, you guys make the episodes more dynamic, and I appreciate it. Make sure to give it a like. I see several listeners, only 3 likes. Make sure to give a like. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications of when I'm on. I'll be on live all of this week at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So in the chat room, going back to what KW Don 7 said, the pimp appears to be made man as the days go by. I'd ask him to to add to that. The pimp has made more ahistorical claims. The made man term means agent of confusion. Okay. Yet he is the first to accuse people of being an agent. Well, I think agents tend to accuse others of being agents, right? Alfred Buddy, I'm just here to listen. Okay, Alfred, welcome. Make sure if you're new here, Alfred, though I think I remember the name from before, but if you are new here, make sure to click the like and to subscribe. The Pro-Black Perspective says, where you find her? Yeah. Black male hegemony. Yeah. I kind of messed up here, didn't I? KW Don 7 says, I don't believe that there is a black matriarchy. What we have in the diaspora is a dysfunctional patriarchy. Okay. KW Don 7, by all means, expand on that. Achieve Mindset says, nah, we have a dysfunctional matriarchy. Alfred Buddy says, amen to hegemony. And yes, a dysfunctional patriarchy with white supremacy funded matriarch. Wow, that's an interesting one, Alfred. You should expand on that a little bit more too. I mean, in my movements, I see more so a matriarchy. And if you go back, I talked about the toxic masculinity thing. In my experience, and from what I see and from what I keep seeing, and maybe it's the case that I'm seeing what I want to see, but I don't think that's the case. I do see that what people call toxic masculinity, for example, I know this is not the topic here, but what people call toxic masculinity often are young men or men who were raised by women. I find it interesting some of you said it's a patriarchy, when I think it's pretty clear it's mostly a matriarchal society. Black society is mostly matriarchal, and some of the reasons for that is black men dying, black men being in prison, some black men just being worthless, to be frank. And so they've just stepped aside and let women do the work. I think on a larger scale, like if you look at, say, the continent, as we read some papers weeks ago, I think in terms of nation building, that's when men tend to jump in there. So if you're talking about, say, like in the consciousness movement, you will tend to see a lot more men pushing themselves to the front of the line. That I agree. But if you look at just regular general life in black society, even in the Caribbean to a certain extent, you'll see a lot of it is a lot of communities are led by women, right? But when you talk about when you talk about like the nation building and dudes trying to look good and look grandiose and all this type of shit, yeah, that's when they push women to the side and to the back, right? Alfred Buddy says this all stems from the report from Nixon on the black family. Abortion, I forgot to mention abortion, and prison makes it a matriarchy. But this is all the, Alfred Buddy continues, but this is all design and incentives to carry out these. Yeah, and we do fall for the trick of it too, on both sides, male and female. Another reason to doubt that insistence on a common black identity would contribute to black solidarity and thus to the elimination of racial oppression is that if blacks were to push for a thicker common black identity, this would actually strain the already somewhat delicate bonds of black unity. For while most blacks believe in the struggle for social equality and the value of black communal relations, they also value the freedom to choose their cultural affiliations. Yeah, and that's really the problem. If there is group pressure to conform to some prototype of blackness, which collective identity theory would seem to require, this would create core and fringe black subgroups, thus alienating those on the fringe and providing them with an incentive to defect from the collective struggle. Those who only marginally fit the black prototype may feel that accepting a conventional black identity is unduly burdensome and consequently may only half-heartedly participate, if at all, in the black fight against racism, especially if acting alone they can manage perhaps through their superior class position to escape some of the more severe forms of racial oppression. Thus, a prescribed black identity could actually reduce black unity, and it might even have the unintended consequence of inviting those who fail to identify with the prevailing conception of blackness to form alternative alliances, to become excessively individualistic, or to be simply complacent. One response to these considerations is to insist that there already exists an inclusive and widely shared black identity, so that blacks need only to preserve and perhaps cultivate it. But this claim is implausible. Blacks taken in the thin sense are clearly an ethnically and culturally diverse group. This diversity includes differences in physical appearance, language, customs, religion, political outlook, moral and aesthetic values, cuisine, fashion, traditions, national origin, and many other things. The cultural and ethnic diversity of blacks should be especially clear once one considers the various cultural traits embraced by recent black immigrants from Africa, Latin America, Europe, and the Caribbean, who are, of course, themselves subject to anti-black prejudice. And to me, that's really the bottom line. Like the bottom line is that we all experience this white nationalism, right? These whites maintaining their nation. So that really should be what we unite under. And then the rest should be us understanding each other. Remember, I talked about that in the Unity Open discussion. We often don't take time to understand one another. Like, do you understand an African, for example? Do you understand a Caribbean person? Right? Do you understand what makes us similar and what makes us different? And how much different are we really? You know? However, this would have the effect of rendering collective identity theory vacuous, since blacks cannot help but embrace cultural traits of one sort or other, and thus the imperative to conserve blackness would have no prescriptive force. In the chat room, KW7 says there has never been a matriarchy. The world is ruled by force, men being physically superior to women. Women cannot oppose their will on men. I feel what you're saying. KW7, I feel what you're saying. That's the thing. The matriarchy that I'm talking about is a very soft power. Really, in black society, you know, who runs the house, you know, and other aspects of black living is really the women. But it is not a power that stands up against other nations. Do you feel me? It's more so, it's almost, you could say, like a local power as opposed to, say, a national power, if that makes sense. Right? That's what I mean when I say, like, there's this matriarchy, but it's not this thing. And you know, we've had African women defeat, you know, other groups or whatnot, but I get your point. You know, in the end, at the end of things, it's not this, when I say this matriarchy, it's not this thing that really bodies any other group, right? They're not bodying any white group. They're not bodying, you know, white women, or they're not bodying any white nations or anything like that, right? I like it. I like KW Dawn 7. He says blacks in the diaspora are subject to a white male patriarchy, right? Where the black woman has some jobs and benefits. Now we talk. I can ride with that. Okay, I can ride with that. And as such, in many ways, you know, the black man is kind of subordinated to the black women under that paradigm that you just put there. So black. Okay. So to continue. Alternatively, one might argue that it is possible to construct a pluralistic and nuanced conception of black identity rather than a monolithic and unduly restrictive one. Yeah, anytime you get people talking about this monolithic and unduly restrictive type stuff, that's a person who wants to be integrated. That's just the bottom line, right? Oh, great point, KW Dawn 7. Black males have failed to develop an economy that would sustain our women. Yeah, and that, you know, that's a good point. And you will hear the pro-black perspective talk about that a lot too. You know, without the economy, who will the woman really go to? Who will the black woman really go to? If you don't have an economy for them to flourish under, then who will they go to? The thing I have about that is, you go back several months ago, earlier in the pandemic, there was Meg Thee Stallion cupcaking with a white boy on Instagram. And then later on, she gets in that altercation with, which I still don't know if it's true or not. I just could listen to what she says and what the other little dude says. But when she started talking about black men don't protect black women, well, where was the white boy who was cupcaking with on Instagram? But again, if we don't have an economy, right, we could expect them not to, we could expect there to be some disloyalty. But no matter where one sets the boundaries of thick blackness, if it is meaningful enough to have prescriptive force, some blacks will be left out or forced into submission. Now, the collective destiny theorists, the collective identity theorists, might not be troubled by this assault, since he may insist that not all blacks are needed in the struggle against anti-black racism, and some will be indifferent to the fight for racial equality anyway. However, it can't simply be assumed on the basis of cultural identification alone who will or won't be willing to make such a solidaristic commitment. And thus it is more reasonable to be as inclusive as possible. What do you guys think about that point? All right. What do you think about that point? All right. Some people won't be willing to be so on point, so to speak. So if you're gonna lose those people out, why not be more inclusive or be as inclusive as possible? I don't believe in that, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. Indeed, it may turn out that the least black among us are actually among those most dedicated to the cause of racial justice, despite the widespread assumption to the contrary. In any case, insisting, you know what it sounds like? It sounds like she might be one of these passing Negroes. This author sounds like she could be a passing Negro. And she is unloading her frustration here. In any case, insisting on a specific conception of black identity, regardless of how pluralistic it is taken to be, is still vulnerable to the criticisms raised earlier against the politics of black authenticity. Blacks will find themselves in an unnecessary, contentious, distracting, and interminable debate over what counts as black and who will decide. I personally think a lot of folks who spend that time talking about what's black and who will decide are people who are not interested in really doing what is necessary. Right? They're unfocused. You know, keep it simple of what blackness is and keep it moving. What must be recognized here is that the concept black, and by simple, I'm referring to like what you hear in the African proverbs, what Malcolm is, you know, one of his famous quotes about a cat having kittens in an oven. Are the kittens not cats, or are they ovens, right? And so we just got to keep it like that, right? What must be recognized here is that the concept black is an ideological construct. And like many such constructs, it is extremely malleable and capacious. Consequently, blackness can be and has been given multiple and divergent interpretations, varying with who is interpreting it, their motives for using the notion, and the social circumstances under which they employ it. Thus, the most that can be truly said is that there are a number of loosely associated and variously interpreted black identities. The one link that often does exist between these multiple identities, however, is that many of them have been formed in an anti-black social environment, and each, in its own way, will likely bear the marks of race-based ill treatment. I would urge blacks to identify with each other on the basis of their common oppression and commitment to resisting it, and form the standpoint of black solidarity. And from the standpoint of black solidarity, each would be allowed without molestation to interpret blackness however she or he sees fit, provided the interpretation does not advocate anything immoral and is consistent with the principles and goals of anti-racism. For you guys in the chat room, what are your thoughts on that idea? Identify on the common basis of oppression and the commitment to resisting it. And the individual should be allowed to see blackness or see where they fit in the paradigm of blackness however they want to. So you could have Rachel Dolezal involved. You could have Talcum X. What's that fellow name? Talcum X's name. You know what I mean. The white dude who thinks he's black because his mom slept with a bunch of different black dudes and he's a journalist, right? And he just assumed, well, since she was sleeping with all these black dudes, well, maybe I'm black too. So that could be those types of people involved, right? What are your thoughts on that? In this way, I am not suggesting, as some have, that individual blacks should give up their various black identities in favor of an American, cosmopolitan, or simply human identity, though there should clearly be more mindfulness of its dangers and limitations. I see no reason to object, at least not in principle, to blacks identifying with what they take to be their culture or ethnic heritage. What I want to resist, though, is the tendency to think that blacks must share a distinctive black identity if they are to be a unified force against anti-black racism. Sean King, yeah, that's Talcum X. Thanks. KW Don 7 coming through. Right? That brings us to this section here. Let me take a quick station ID. I know it's late. Take a quick station ID. I'll be back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
And we're back. Just a quick reminder, make sure you guys check out the other shows on KWAZ Radio. Help to get their subs and the likes on their videos up as well. So make sure to subscribe, click the bell to be notified when they're on or when they post new content, which also includes the Queen's Council. I forgot to mention that the Queen's Council is also one of the shows on KWAZ Radio, so make sure to support them as well. So let's go to this section called Black Solidarity Without Black Cultural Nationalism. At this point, I would like to confront a well-known argument in favor of the ethnic cultural version of collective identity theory. This argument takes various forms. Is a general characterization of prevented slaves from reproducing their African cultural forms, and historically blacks have often been misinformed or prevented from learning about their African heritage. Such actions have deprived generations of blacks of knowledge of their ethnic origins. Moreover, a racist ideology has spread which maintains that blacks have no worthwhile culture of their own, neither past nor present, and that therefore they should allow themselves to be assimilated into a civilized, that is, white culture. Thus, part of the oppression that blacks have experienced involves the malicious deprecation of black culture. This assault on the value of the cultural contributions of black people has been so thoroughly damaging to the self-esteem of blacks that many fail to identify with and take pride in their unique cultural heritage. Instead, some accept the inherent superiority of the culture of their oppressors and sadly embrace it rather than their own. Such persons are often fraudulent, self-hating, or servile, and therefore they cannot be trusted by other blacks with a more authentic, self-affirming, and liberated black consciousness. Thus, in order both to reclaim their self-respect and dignity as a people and to foster group solidarity, blacks must participate in, celebrate, and identify with black culture. Once we fully understand this, we will see that a collective black identity is not only a necessary component of black solidarity, it is a constitutive part of black liberation from the effects of white domination. Historically and even now, this has been a very influential argument. And like so many others, I too have been tempted to accept its conclusion. But this urge must be resisted. Powerful as it is, for while much of what the argument suggests is both true and important, it simply does not follow that our best or only response to the issues it raises is to make a collective Black identity a component of Black solidarity. To show this, I will examine what I take to be the three most important questions for which this argument was intended as an answer. Question 1. How can Blacks restore and maintain their dignity in the face of white cultural hegemony and the devaluation of Black cultures? For decades now, Blacks have fought the wide acceptance of white supremacist values and the stigma attached to their cultural ways by celebrating both privately and publicly Black history and Black cultures. This has been done through a variety of vehicles, including Black History Month, African American, Latin American, and Caribbean cultural festivals, Black periodicals, books and documentaries, African American museums and archives, the BET network, the BET network, Black religious and political organizations, Black private schools and colleges, Black studies programs at predominantly white universities, and more recently, numerous sites on the World Wide Web. These are all essential efforts to educate Blacks and non-Blacks about Black history and Black struggles, to instill a sense of pride in Black people about what they've accomplished and overcome, and to cultivate a greater appreciation for the cultural contributions of Black people to this country and the world. In addition, the very act of cultural expression has an important role to play in Black liberation. One way to fight against the dissemination of racist ideology is through cultural forms, such as literature, film, music, theater, dance, humor, painting, sports, theology, modes of speech, dress, and hairstyle. Black people have a long and remarkable history of using cultural practices, including those traditionally considered white, not only to express themselves aesthetically and spiritually, but to resist and subvert the forms of racial domination that oppress them. Moreover, Black people in particular, Black intellectuals and social critics, must continue to be defiant and vigilant in the face of the continuing and sometimes subtle presence of white cultural domination, submitting it to incisive critique and exposing the ideology for the fraud that it is. However, in doing these important things, we do not need to follow the collective identity theorists in the view that Blacks must also embrace a common Black ethnic cultural identity. One can acknowledge the importance of learning about Black history and understanding Black cultures without treating cultural Blackness, however delimited, as defining who one is or allowing it to set the boundaries for one's choices. Black people can also resist white cultural domination, even using elements of culture itself, without establishing a common culture of resistance that all must embrace and celebrate. There is no doubt that Blacks should be informed about Black history and cultures, as should non-Blacks, for at a minimum, this will help them to better understand the nature of their racial subordination and the possible roots out of it. This paper is written by one Tommie Shelby. I wonder if that's the pen name for like Rachel Dolezal or something. Right? There's no doubt that but I would add, and coming to this greater understanding of the past, present, and possible future, Blacks should be careful not to be seduced by the project of Black cultural redemption. Black people should not be in the business of proving the greatness of their cultural heritage, for this is to be pulled into the all too familiar discourse of racial chauvinism, an ideology that wrongly treats cultural achievement as a function of race. Racial chauvinism. That's an interesting cultural achievement as a function of race. Okay. Question 2. Setting aside mass psychotherapy, what kind of remedy is there for the problem of internalized racial oppression among blacks, the so-called black inferiority complex? Before discussing this question, first notice that the ideological attack on blacks not only involves the devaluation of black cultures, but also extends to the denigration of the intelligence, physical beauty, and moral character of black people. At various times, blacks have been viewed as childlike, stupid, and lazy, thus in need of white paternalism. At other times, blacks are depicted as wild, vicious, and impulsive, and therefore in need of being controlled and contained. Worse yet, and this is the heart of the matter, these negative images have also seeped into the consciousness of many blacks, often without their being aware of it. Part of the remedy of this type of self-alienation is to be found in the strategies already mentioned. Spreading accurate information about black history and cultural forms. This is what KW Don 7 was talking about with the pimp. Right? Using various forms of cultural expression to resist and subvert anti-black racism, and engaging in the relentless critique of the doctrine and practice of racial domination. However, there is still more that can be done. Black people can also bond together to collectively combat their racial oppression in a more coordinated way. Indeed, the need to overcome the self-contempt produced by anti-black racism is an important part of the justification for black solidarity. Given the widespread internalization of anti-black race prejudice, it becomes necessary for black people to be a significant, if not the primary force behind their liberation from racial subordination. It is not enough for black people to be freed from their subordinate position by their non-black allies and sympathizers. They must participate in a meaningful way in freeing themselves. The collective struggle for self-emancipation, even if unuseful, can itself enhance the participants' sense of dignity and self-respect. Moreover, even if unuseful, fighting together to free themselves from racial exclusion and domination is one way, in addition to the ones already mentioned, for blacks to strengthen their conviction that the doctrine of white supremacy is a vicious lie. No doubt, blacks should have a liberated consciousness. One that is free as possible from the devastating effects of racist ideology. However, in freeing their minds from the grip of such degrading and essentialist images of themselves, they don't need to, nor should they, replace these representations with another essentialized group identity, no matter how positive or group affirming some may think it to be. Let me just check something here. Okay. So it seems like my stream is still good. My internet stream is still good. So I'll continue. No doubt. Question number 3. But what about the assimilated black who rejects his black identity in favor of a white persona and cultural lifestyle? Can he really be trusted by other blacks in the collective struggle when he shows no loyalty to black culture? This answer is going to be a doozy. It depends on how he conducts himself in other contexts, especially those that bear directly on anti-racist struggles. Granted, sometimes when a black person chooses not to identify with what he or she takes to be black culture, this is accompanied by a lack of identification with black struggles against racism. But clearly we would be unjustified in assuming that this is always the case. As was argued earlier, we cannot simply infer a black person's lack of loyalty and trustworthiness in the fight against racial oppression from the fact that he does not define himself in terms of black culture. Many so-called assimilated blacks have played important roles in the struggle against racism, and it would be unreasonable and insulting to doubt the sincerity of their commitment to black solidarity simply because they did not embrace a black ethnic cultural identity. Who are some of these people? Can you guys think of some of these alleged people? The fact is, a person can show her loyalty to the cause of black liberation and thus her trustworthiness as an ally in black resistance to racism in ways other than through cultural identification. She can, for example, work to help ensure that the next generation of blacks has a lighter burden of racial oppression than the present one. Such hard work and protests against racism should be sufficient to eliminate any suspicion that might arise due to the person's lack of black cultural identification. If the person were truly self-hating and servile, then she would be unlikely to openly struggle and sacrifice to advance the interests of the very group whose abject status is the source of her self-contempt. We should be careful not to reject potential allies in our collective effort to end racism on the ground that they do not share our ethnic cultural identity. It is much more important, indeed critical, that those we seek solidarity with share our anti-racist values and our commitment to eliminating racial oppression and the social problems it causes. This brings us to a section, this has to be one of the last sections, I believe, common oppression as a basis for black solidarity. The conception of black solidarity advocated in this essay is hardly new, though it is often conflated with similar positions, including various forms of black nationalism, and at times wrongly thought to require a thick black identity. It is, I believe, widely held among blacks. Indeed, in the latter part of his life, Du Bois himself comes around to something like this view. In Dusk of Dawn, Du Bois reflects on his deeply felt tie to Africa, which he can feel better than he can explain. But one thing is sure, and that is the fact that since the 15th century, these ancestors of mine and their other descendants have had a common history, have had suffered a common disaster, and have one long memory. The actual ties of heritage between the individuals of this group vary with the ancestors that they have in common and many others. Europeans and Semites, perhaps Mongolians, certainly American Indians. But the physical bond is least, and the badge of color is relatively unimportant, save as a badge. The real essence of this kinship is its social heritage of slavery, the discrimination and insult, and this heritage binds together not simply the children of Africa, but extends through Yellow Asia and into South Seas. It is this unity that draws me to Africa. I don't even know what the fuck he's talking about there. Can someone interpret that? Like, what is he talking about? Again, beware who they always push out there on. Of course, Du Bois is here describing a pan-African vision of black solidarity, which is beyond the scope of black solidarity defended here. but he does root his broader conception of black solidarity not in a thick collective identity as he does in his conservation essay, but in the common experience of racialized oppression throughout the world. In the space remaining, I want to briefly summarize the common oppression conception of black solidarity that I've been defending here and anticipate a few objections to it. As I've emphasized, the mutual identification between blacks, that familiar sense of we-ness, can be founded on the shared experience of anti-black racism. That common experience, made possible by our racial ascription as black people, includes such things as bearing the weight of the stigma attached to looking and acting black, being subject to the vicissitudes of a racially segmented labor market, suffering discrimination on the basis of presumed incompetence, enduring the systemic exclusion from certain neighborhoods, schools, and social circles, recognizing that one is often the object of unjustified hatred, contempt, suspicion, or fear, feeling powerless to change one's inferior racial status, functioning as the perennial scapegoat for social problems and economic crisis, and living with the knowledge that one is vulnerable to being victimized at almost any time by an anti-black attitude, action, social practice, or institutional policy. I mean, that's a good blurb right there to inspire people to nation build. Right? In your nation, you wouldn't feel or endure, these things. As an emancipatory solidarity group, blacks must be committed to social equality and respect for group differences, which means rooting out racism wherever it exists, even within our own ranks. For while we identify with each other because of our common suffering under anti-black oppression, our stance against our oppressors must be a principled one if our indignation and resentment are to be justified. It is important to see that an oppression-centered black solidarity is not a matter of being anti-white or even pro-black. And here's the bullshit. It is important to see that an oppression-centered black solidarity, it's not a matter of being anti-white or even pro-black, but being anti-racist. So this is what we got folks out here talking about now. In the chat room, Razuliism is here. Peace to Razuliism. He says solidarity after he helped them kick Marcus Garvey out. Yeah, that's W.E.B. Du Bois. After helping set the stage for Garvey to being jailed and deported, right? Now he talks about solidarity, and even in that solidarity that he's talking about, he's doing that thing that so many of our people tend to do, which is link our struggles to some type of human rights struggle. And that irks me. And some of our respective elders, our respected elders, shared those kind of thoughts. I've said it before, frankly, I don't care about Palestinian oppression. Let them do their thing and get out of it. I'm not linking my oppression to theirs. Right? I'm not linking my oppression to theirs or anyone else's. I'm not linking my situation to anyone else's. Because then when black folks finally get it together and build this nation, everyone else is going to want to be in this nation. Nah. Now we're good. Razuliism says black people can't be racist. I think he's saying that in response to this line that says it is important to see that an oppression-centered black solidarity is not a matter of being anti-white. Right? Consequently, solidarity with other racially oppressed groups, and even with committed anti-racist whites, is not precluded by it. Thus, progressive individuals, regardless of their race, ethnicity, cultural identification, or national origin, have no reason to oppose black solidarity once its basis and point are properly understood. So this is that soft serve ice cream I talked about earlier, right? You want to push this idea of black solidarity, but not too strong now. Let's add some milk to our black coffee. You know, anyone can be an ally. You know, this is just weak. Group loyalty and mutual trust can be cultivated through our individual and collective struggles against racial domination and inequality. Those we most seek solidarity with then are not necessarily those who most exhibit a thick black identity, but rather those who stand firm against all forms of racism, regardless of their racial or cultural identifications. Rather than being rooted in race, ethnicity, or culture, the group's self-conception is grounded in its anti-racist politics and its commitment to racial justice. Listen, if our struggle is not rooted in our race, if our racial struggle is not rooted in our race, then it's not a racial struggle anymore. But a lot of black folks eat this type of shit up. Well, brother, you know it's not race now. It's about class now, brother. I mean, shut up. In the chat room, KW Don says anti-racism is a trick bag. Absolutely. You will not convince Urugu to feed your children over his own. Amos Wilson taught that. Yeah, you have to be about, you know, taking care of your own people. You can't rely on anyone else to do it. And so if you're fighting against oppression, you gotta do. You think these white folks are going to, you know, like I saw a tweet today, and the guy quickly blocked me after I retweeted it. But there was a tweet today. Let me see if I could possibly find it. He blocked me, so I might not be able to gather what the original tweet is. Yeah, I can't gather anymore. But he was basically talking about reparations for black folks in America. And he listed off how reparations won't necessarily get rid of racism and, you know, blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, that's why, you know, the blah, blah, blah stuff is what I'm kind of not remembering. But I said, you know, this is why you won't get the reparations. Well, of course, I was immediately blocked. Right? I was immediately, you're not going to get, these folks are not going to lower their power level, so to speak, by giving you something that raises yours. It just is, it's insane. I can't believe a lot of our folks can get it. I just don't understand it. There must be room within an emancipatory black solidarity for disagreement over the precise content of our anti-racist politics. The ideals of racial equality and respect for group difference are open to a variety of interpretations, and reasonable people can disagree over both the appropriate strategies for overcoming racial oppression and the exact meaning of Black liberation. Some of these disagreements may run deep, say between radicals and conservatives, and thus it is unlikely that we can reach consensus on a comprehensive political paradigm. This is Afro-pessimism, or Black pessimism. However, we know that we all want to live in a society where being or thought to be Black is not a disadvantage or stigma, and where all can live with dignity and self-respect regardless of their so-called race. These somewhat vague ideals and goals can provide Black solidarity with a rough normative guide, which can be made more precise and complete through open-ended dialogue about where to go from here and how to get there. Though there will inevitably be perhaps intense disagreements among Blacks over the details of our anti-racist policies, we should debate these matters with open minds and without allowing ourselves to be sidetracked by the irresolvable controversy over what it means to be really Black. Should it happen that our bonds begin to fracture because of the depth of our political disagreements, and perhaps that time is now again upon us, we each should remind ourselves and each other, as Frederick Douglass urged long ago, that the mutual recognition of our common subordinate position and our collective will to rise above it are the basis of our unity. Some might wonder why Black solidarity is needed at all, especially since racism is not unique to the experience of Blacks, and, as was conceded earlier, solidarity between anti-racist Blacks and non-Blacks is both possible and desirable. Shouldn't we just reject Black solidarity and embrace interracial, anti-racist solidarity instead? Jesus. I know how to pick 'em, boy, don't I? Yeah. While I certainly would strongly encourage Blacks to work with anti-racist non-Blacks against racism, I do not see why Blacks must give up their solidaristic commitment to each other in order to do so. There is room for nested and overlapping forms of anti-racist solidarity, just as there is space for more or less exclusive and inclusive collective struggles at other sites of oppression. For example, class, gender, sexuality, and their intersections. However, though, broader forms of anti-racist solidarity should be cultivated, there are at least 3 reasons why it is prudent for Blacks to hold on to this narrower commitment as well, at least for the time being. This person likes to write lists, boy. In the chat room, Zuliism says, first of all, is there anything with being racist? We should all put our races first. I mean, that's what everyone else does. Everyone else puts their race first. A Chinaman puts his race first. If the selection comes down to your Black ass or one of his goofy Chinamen, he's going to pick his goofy Chinaman. Same thing with the European, the white boy. First, anti-Black racial oppression, like anti-Semitism, anti-Asian racism, and the oppression of Native Americans, has features that make it unique as a form of racial subjection. The peculiar content of anti-Black racist ideology, with its images of Blacks as lazy, stupid, hypersexual, and disposed to acts of aggression, the enslavement and brutal treatment of Africans in the New World, and the subsequent exclusion of Blacks from the mainstream of American civic and social life, have combined to give anti-Black race prejudice a distinctive character among American forms of racism. There are also severe social problems. For example, joblessness, high rates of incarceration, concentrated poverty, failing schools, a violent drug trade, that plague some black communities and that are partly the result of past and present racial discrimination against blacks in particular. While a joint commitment to fighting racial injustice in all of its forms can help create interracial solidarity, it is often the common experience of specific forms of racial oppression that creates the strongest and most enduring bonds among victims of racism. You know, this writer did something really slick, and they pushed the word interracial till the latter part of the paper. And I think they did that because they knew if they started this paper out with interracial solidarity, it would be a wrap. I see African Sun is in the room. He said something, then took it back. African Sun sounds more like Indian Sun. You're taking back stuff. Post your comments, man. There's no shame here. Second, the black experience with racism in America makes it difficult for many blacks to fully trust non-blacks when it comes to fighting against racism. For they have too often been victimized by the racism of non-blacks, even by some who are racially oppressed themselves. Add to this the fact that other racial minorities have solidaristic communities of their own. For example, Jews, Native Americans, and some Asian groups. And it should be clear that many blacks justifiably feel the need to protect themselves against the dangers that may result from competing group loyalties and interests. A unilateral laying down of solidaristic arms, as it were, would increase black vulnerability to marginalization. Let's see how they flip this idea. All right, so this is what I was talking about. Palestinian will come to America and call me a nigga with no qualms. He or she ain't thinking about my shared oppression with them. And third, the common experience of anti-black racism has for centuries now provided a firm and well-recognized basis for mutual identification between blacks, and this shared experience partially accounts for the solidarity between them that continues to exist today. As we seek to form interracial coalitions in our fight against racism, we should not underestimate or devalue this social bond. Historically, it has been a great source of strength and hope for blacks and a highly effective means for creating greater social equality. I believe that it can and should continue to do so. You know, this sounds like some shit Obama would write. In saying this, however, I am not suggesting that black collective action founded on an oppression-centered black solidarity would be sufficient to eliminate racism. Indeed, it could turn out that nothing we do, even with the help of members from other racial groups, will end racism, especially anti-black racism. Perhaps the most that can be hoped for, at least in the foreseeable future, is that black solidarity will afford blacks a limited form of collective self-defense against some of the more burdensome forms of racial oppression. But this, I should think, would be sufficient to make the effort worthwhile. An oppression-centered black solidarity does not, however, require a common black identity. Though black oppression may be based on or rationalized in terms of an ascribed black identity, this ascription need not be well-founded in order for the oppression to be real or for bonds of solidarity among the racially oppressed to form. The advocate of collective identity theory might here object. Surely an oppression-centered black solidarity must at least require that blacks identify with their thin blackness, for without such a common identity, they will lack a stable foundation for mutual identification. This objection fails, however. To see why, consider the following variant of the well-worn but still instructive witch analogy. trial and subsequent punishment of alleged witches was ostensibly based on the claim that the accused had communed with the forces of the underworld. Though this accusation was most certainly unfounded, these so-called witches nevertheless suffered a common fate. But now let's suppose for a moment that some of the accused really did practice witchcraft. That is, they engaged in sorcery, sought to conspire with the devil, serendipitously corrupted good Christians, and so on. Suppose further that at various points, some of their number, for whatever reason, ceased practicing witchcraft and no longer identified themselves as witches. And finally, well, now, I mean, she's just creating a super specific, right? A super specific analogy. And finally, suppose that at least some of these practitioners of witchcraft believed that some among them were frauds, that is, not really witches, according to some commonly accepted criteria for being a witch, or according to some controversial and strict criteria. Now, despite all this, it seems clear that all these former pseudo and would-be witches could share bonds of solidarity with each other, not based on their common witch identity. For example, hypothesize the existence of a shared identity was in doubt, but based on their common persecution, right? They simply could have put aside the question of who is and who is not an authentic witch and focus their attention and energy on overcoming their common plight. It's just stupid. I mean, that whole thing there was just dumb. Black solidarity could have and should have an analogous foundation. Attachment to their thin black identity is not the basis of the group's solidarity, but rather the shared experience with anti-black racism and the joint commitment to ending it. Blacks need only recognize that part of the reason they often suffer mistreatment is that others see them as thickly black. What? Blacks need only recognize part of the reason they often suffer mistreatment is that others see them as thickly black, their thin blackness being merely a sign of a deeper difference. And this radicalized perception leads their oppressors, sometimes unconsciously, to treat them as a devalued other. Wow. Integrationists, apologists. Identification between members of the racially oppressed group can therefore be based on their mutual recognition of this sad and disturbing fact. It would not undermine black solidarity if, apart from the unjust treatment that they engender, the characteristics that constitute their thin blackness were to have little or no significance for the members of the united oppressed group. Once liberation is achieved, thin blackness may in fact, although it need not, lose all social and political significance. But now some might suggest that even this stripped down common oppression theory commits itself to a version of the collective identity view, for it nevertheless endorses the cultivation of a thick collective black identity. It urges blacks to see themselves as racially oppressed. This shared identity is not based on race, ethnicity, or culture, but on the common experience of anti-black racism. Thus, those blacks who are united by ties of solidarity will still have a collective identity, and one that is not reducible to their political principles or anti-racist politics. This identity might aptly be described as victims of anti-black racial oppression. We could, of course, respond to this objection by simply conceding that is, we could accept that the one thick collective black identity that continues to be a realistic possibility is constituted by our victim status in an anti-black world. This approach to the meaning of blackness is not self-defeating or divisive like the other conceptions we considered. since the vast majority of blacks rightly accept that anti-black racism continues to exist, though of course they have no wish to preserve the conditions under which an oppression-based identity would be advantageous or desirable. Such an identity would not gratuitously add to individual unfreedom, for it is non-racialist and perfectly consistent with cultural ethnic diversity. Moreover, we should not have to go to great lengths to cultivate this identity, for there is more than enough anti-black sentiment and discrimination still around to sustain it. Though admittedly, it may be unnecessary to convince people of the depth of the problem. But this view of blackness would not give the typical collective identity theorist all that he wants, for the search for a collective black identity has generally been a struggle to discover or construct a positive social identity, one that could be a basis for pride, dignity, and collective self-affirmation. A common identity based on nothing more than our shared experience of racism cannot provide such an identity, for this would perversely treat victimhood as something of which to be proud, which is not, of course, to say that it's something of which we should be ashamed. You know, there's truth in that, I think a lot of black folks only revel in the victimhood narrative of blackness, right? And instead of standing on the victimization, the history of victimization, and turning that into power, right? They say no pain, no gain. Turn that pain into gain. And that's really what we need to be doing more of, too. I'm not agreeing with this author, whoever this is, Obama, Rachel Dolezal or some shit, under a pen name. But we do need to turn pain into power, into gain, right? And we don't do that. In the chat room, African Sun seems to have figured out what he wanted to say. He says, one common mind is needed to win and rule the race. Yes, one shared thinking, right? Erzuliism says, blacks need a Dr. Doom. Your comic book guy, Dr. Doom was a guy with powers. I think, I forget now, he might have been rated the most powerful villain in, he's definitely like top 5 powerful villains in the Marvel comics. And he had his own nation. People didn't fuck with him in his nation. People were afraid whenever he left his nation and came out amongst others. So I get the I get the idea. As I get to the conclusion now, what do you guys think of this paper? Put it in the chat room or in the comment section. What do you think of this paper? And I'll read those on air live, and we can have a little discussion on it before I sign up. So in conclusion, if the arguments presented in this article are sound, then Black solidarity can survive the now well-known critique of racial ethnic essentialism. It can be sustained despite the loss of race as a viable biological concept. It can flourish despite the cultural and ethnic diversity of Black people, and it need not unduly constrain individuality of our freedom to construct a pluralistic identity. However, this reconstructed Black solidarity would have to be sustained without the demand for a collective Black identity, for this requirement can only impede the collective struggle that lies ahead. So this argument, in my opinion, is not sound to begin with. And the idea that this collective black identity will only impede the struggle that lies ahead is just nonsense. That's integrationist nonsense. But I'll wait around a few minutes to see what do the guys in the chat room feel about this paper. Be as honest as possible. I will read your comments on air. In the meantime, let me remind you guys what's being offered KWAZ Radio.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
And I'm back. African Sun says, sounds white. Which would be incredible if a white person had the audacity to talk all this junk, right? It would be incredible for a white person to have the audacity to speak in this manner, right? This article was published in the publication of Ethics. So this is not like previous articles that were published like in the Journal of Black Studies or what have you. So it is possible that this is a white person who's talking this, right? But let's assume it's not a white person. And let's assume it's someone black. This kind of thing is what leads us to question the college-educated black person. Because this paper was likely peer-reviewed, or some mentor, some PhD mentor or something approved it to be published. And or this author, let's say this author is a PhD holder. This author went through the rigors of a PhD program, talking and thinking this way, right? In order to have their thesis approved, their dissertation approved for them to get their papers. And so this is the problem that we have when we don't educate our own people. They got to go around these folks, learn and talk and do things the way these other folks do things, these non-black folks do things. And they have to put out quote-unquote think pieces like this, right, in order to survive that world. If this person was writing on behalf of, again, assuming that this person is one of us, this person was one of us and writing on behalf of a university or publication or what have you, that was created, that was built by us, we would see less of this kind of foolishness. So even in a bad paper like this, there's a lesson to be learned. As KW Dawn 7 says, it's assimilationist, integrationist fantasy. And to combat fantasy, you have to use reality. And this fantasy is a product of this person's education and who they receive their education from. To combat that, we have to build our centers of education. And we don't realize how much ground we're giving up every day when we don't contribute to that endeavor. You are better off if you can't homeschool, but at least giving a home education to your children and a home education for yourselves, even as adults. You know, if you're an adult right now and you're uncertain, go listen to the Pro-Black Perspective. If you're worried about your children and you want to see them do better in terms of their knowledge and how they learn and how they connect with their community and how they are able to solve the problems in their community based on the fact they were educated in learning how to solve the problems in their communities, then come through, help me out with the curriculum. To not do so as an adult, if you're not listening to Pro-Black Perspective, for example, you're not checking my show out, you're not helping, you are leaving things up to chance. And when you leave things up to chance, again, assuming that Tommie Shelby is black, then you get the people like Tommie Shelby. We gotta stop leaving things up to chance. Anyway, guys, this has been a lengthy episode. I wanna give a shout out to some people. Shout out to KW Don 7, always supporting, always interacting on social media. Want to give a shout out to African Sun. Shout out to Zuliism. Shout out to Sister Renee. I'm almost certain she's listening. Shout out to Alfred Buddy. Or Booty. Nah, you know what? Let's go back to Buddy. Shout out to Alfred Buddy. And shout out to the Pro-Black Perspective. Tuning in, making the show more dynamic than it would have been had it just been me reading this paper. Until the next time, which, as you know, will be tomorrow night, peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.